So the G7 leaders will have lots to consider when they come together to discuss how to build a more peaceful and secure world. North Korea, Iran, terrorism, Russian aggression, Syria, cybersecurity, all of that on the agenda. Canada's stated objective for the summit is to set the international agenda on peace and security by establishing an inclusive and sustainable way forward for G7 partners. But here's the big question. Will any of that matter to Donald Trump? He's got his own agenda, and he's not worried about being offside with allies. So what should we expect to see when the leaders talk about peace and security? My next guest can certainly help us with that. From Washington today, we're joined by Laura Dawson, the director of the Canada Institute at the Wilson Centre. And here in our studios in Ottawa, Colin Robertson is a former Canadian diplomat in Washington and now vice president and fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. And Wesley Wark is the director of the Security and Policy Institute for Professional Development at the University of Ottawa. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming to talk about this important subject. And Laura, if I can, let me start with you. G7 meetings, I think used to be pretty predictable affairs with communiques focused on consensus, often written even before the meetings actually take place. But not sure that's the case anymore with Donald Trump in the White House. Disruption, not consensus, seems to be the norm. What do you think we'll see when the leaders get around the table talking about security and world peace at this summit?
So we're going to see a situation where the leaders are really trying to manage Donald Trump. It's really not about getting consensus among the 7 leaders. It's really going to be about how to avoid any blow-ups, how to keep Donald Trump from going so far offline, setting the furniture on fire that they really lose track of the bigger agenda. And it's notable that this is Donald Trump's first official visit to Canada. We'll see how that goes. Fortunately, he doesn't have to pass through any major cities, any major airports, any major population bases, so there's not likely he's going to be encountering any Canadian protesters. But getting Donald Trump to Canada and back, getting everyone to mind their manners, managing that Trump relationship, that's going to be job one. The rest of the agenda is kind of incidental to that.
All right, Colin Robertson, what are your expectations for, any kind of consensus on some of these major issues that face the G7 allies?
Well, as Laura says, the G7 is a process, and so what you've had over the years, you've had the series of meetings, the Sherpas who guide this thing through. These are the personal representatives of the leaders, and then this whole series of meetings around issues including security. So in Toronto a month ago, we had the security and foreign ministers meeting, and they went over the big issues, the ones you enumerated, everything from Venezuela to North Korea to Iran, the Middle East. And that is, although notably Mike Pompeo, the new Secretary of State, was not there, but they tried to work things out. But you would have, of course, American representatives there. So they'll try and have something for the leaders when they get there. But as you point out, the unpredictable factor in this is Donald Trump. And so I guess from a Canadian perspective, just getting through these the 2 days will be critical. And does Donald Trump stay the 2 days? Because, of course, he has other things potentially on the agenda, a North Korea summit and the rest. And if they do get through the 2 days, what does the communique say? Because there is big divisions on issues like the Middle East, on issues like Iran. Can they come up with something? Because the communique is meant to be consensual, or do we simply have a chairman's report?
Right. Wesley, so many of these things are about expectations. What are yours?
I think that it'll be very interesting to see the leaders get together, and I think one of the big topics of conversation is going to be the issue around the summit on North Korea, U.S. North Korea and denuclearization. And I think that all the other G7 members, in addition to Donald Trump, will be interested in getting his view on the likelihood of that and what the American agenda might be, and also to the extent that they can, providing their own kind of input on what they'd like to see happen in that summit. And it'd be interesting to see to what extent Donald Trump is open to advice from foreign leaders on that issue, because he's surrounded at the moment by a very small coterie of people, I think, in Washington who may be giving him advice that runs in one direction only. So I think that'll be an interesting test for Donald Trump in an international summit, an interesting test for other leaders to see what they might be able to come up with a kind of consensus on approaching North Korea. I think there are a couple of other issues where some common ground can be found. One is around cybersecurity, and there was a foreign minister's communique on that. issue coming out of Toronto, and I think there'll be more discussion there. And it's an issue where I think there's a lot of common ground between all the G7 ministers and leaders. And then the final thing that may well be a subject for conversation is just, what next in terms of global terrorism after the military demise, at least, of the Islamic State.
Let me go back to the North Korea summit, if I can, Laura. And what do you think? Wesley suggests that one of the things to watch is how open Donald Trump is to input from other leaders about how to approach that summit. How open do you think he'll be?
The U.S. traditionally is not a multilateralist country historically, but then you take a guy like Donald Trump, who really is a go-your-own-way unilateralist, not just unilateralist with other countries, but unilateralist with his own government, with his own cabinet. He goes his own way. If he sees some sort of an advantage to bringing in a group of countries to his North Korea plans, then potentially, but all signs point against any sort of a multilateral or go-as-a-group approach. This is somebody who does something on the spur of the moment, on the fly, and usually in an individual, autonomous way.
Where can they, do you think they can achieve some sort of consensus, Colin? I mean, Wesley touched on some of the things we should watch for. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's right. I think cybersecurity, I think on the kind of new security issues, they can, because you can move into areas like pandemics and health. There's a number of other sort of issues which I think broad security, but one thing they won't, I don't see, will be trade, because trade is also important to the security because that's what ensures our prosperity. I think it's going to be a challenge. I think you end up basically 6-1. The United States, or actually Donald Trump, in one chair, and then the others, and that will be the real challenge for Justin Trudeau. Because remember, prior to the meeting, he will have held a series of conversations with these leaders. We know he talks to Donald Trump on a regular basis. He will be doing his best to try and, because ultimately he as chair is the one who has to bring all this together. So he will be doing setup prior to. He's talked to most of the other leaders. Now Italy, of course, we're still not entirely sure who's actually going to be there, but that will be his challenge. And then when he's there, he'll have 2 days in order to craft some kind of, if he can, a consensus. That's the objective.
We talk cybersecurity, we talk interfering in the democratic process, and we talk Russia. Can I ask, is it clear where Donald Trump stands on the relationship with Russia? To be clear, I mean, it used to be the G8 and Russia was there, and Russia got kicked out. So, is Donald Trump prepared to take to sign on to a communique, if there is one, that strongly condemns Putin and the actions of Russia, given the sort of different kinds of in the relationship we seem to see with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin? Wesley?
It's a good question. It's hard to know, and that's insider Washington politics. That's always very hard to figure out with the Trump administration. I think one could point to the possibility of Donald Trump agreeing to some kind of statement and discussion about Russia and Russian aggression and Russian intentions. And that's signaled by a couple of major strategy papers that the Trump administration has put out in the last several months: a national security strategy, a defense strategy, both of which had a certain kind of message about Russia from the Trump administration point of view. One, that it was a competitor, a rival, an aggressive actor. But the other message alongside that was that Russia was a power that the United States had to figure out ways to work with. So, that might be the sort of point of navigation on that with the other G7 partners. Just to come back briefly to the North Korean summit, it's not about multilateralism taking sudden effect in the mind of Donald Trump, but it strikes me as a perfect opportunity that comes about rarely at G7 meetings for the other leaders, many of whom more experienced in international relations, to do a couple of things. One is to actually stoke Donald Trump's ego. Fantastic that you're meeting, such an audacious, ambitious move.
But do you think he would like that?
He would love that. I think that's a safe bet, the safest bet we can make about the G7 summit. But alongside that,
medal for the summit.
The stoking the ego medal awarded to all other G7 leaders. But the other, substantive thing that can be done is that alongside that, it may well be that Donald Trump is open to some messaging about how, alongside that ego-stroking message, how you might best succeed in that summit. You know, to have certain kinds of ambitions, but not be overly ambitious for a very first meeting. And I think it's hard to know whether Trump would be open to that discussion, which is a very sort of closed discussion, of course, of the G7 that is not meant to leak out at all. But he might well be.
Laura, what do you think?
Well, I think an important dimension, though, is although it's about a meeting of leaders, it is not just about the leaders. So if we get a signal that is non-toxic or at least relatively benign on certain issues that the U.S. could be brought on board with, if Donald Trump is on board with things like cyber, things like new resources to development, to competitiveness, to dealing with terrorism, then a nod from the president then opens up all sorts of other resources within the United States, the State Department, USAID, Treasury, Commerce, National Security Council. These are folks that really want to be out doing good works in the world. So once you get a nod from the president, or at least not a veto, then the U.S. can go ahead and begin to apply some of its great resources in the world. And they can do so much more than many of the other small economies. So while the president is sort of a volatile character in this meeting, having a good presidential participation could open up a lot of positive U.S. resources into fulfilling the broader agenda.
Let's finish on this. Some observers have expressed concerns that we could end up with a de facto G6, that Trump gets isolated, and that's probably not a good thing. What do you think the likelihood of that is, Colin?
Well, that's the fear, that you wind up with that, and we've seen that before at NATO, and we've seen it at the last G7 to a degree. But so that's what certainly Justin Trudeau is trying to avoid. You want to try to have, first of all, Donald Trump stay for the 2 days, and secondly, to be able to come up with a consensual communique that reflects all the members, not a truncated version or just a chairman's report that the Prime Minister has to make because they can't get that consensus. So in a sense, the expectation levels are low, and what they're really trying to do is avoid a disaster.
Wesley?
I would put expectations as higher, a little higher than that, not to be overly optimistic about it. But I think, you know, all of the other G7 leaders approach this summit with a clear view of the difficulty of dealing with Donald Trump, and they will have, you know, despite the overall kind of agenda for the G7, they will have issues that they're pre-positioned to advance with Donald Trump, where they think there's going to be common ground. And so, you know, I think at the end of the day, Canada has 5 sort of key themes for the G7. I'm not sure all of those will be advanced with equal force, because they'll pick and choose the ones to keep Donald Trump on side. But I do think that the G7 meeting is happening at an unexpectedly potentially beneficial moment, you know, given that the centrality of what I think will be the discussion on the North Korean summit.
All right, Laura, final word to you. What are your thoughts on the likelihood that we end up with a summit where Donald Trump's been isolated and things have been turned upside down?
Yeah, I think that's very unlikely. The last 20 minutes have given all of the other 6 an opportunity to learn how to manage Donald Trump. And you've got folks like Abe, Macron, and Justin Trudeau in particular, who've been very good at managing that relationship to make sure that he gets to look good and to make sure that he gets the things that he wants. And those of us that are in this sort of small country interdependent relationship with the United States, it's really not about turning your back on this country. It's about finding ways to manage and build productive conversations in the areas that we can, and especially given Canada's linkages right now with the United States on NAFTA, on so many other issues. You just can't afford to fold up your tent and walk away. You've got to figure out how to deal with the United States.
Right. Well, we hope they all stay for the whole summit in the Charlevoix region. There's hopefully no tent folding, nobody taking off. So I appreciate all of you giving us your perspective on this. Thank you.
Thank you.